My name is Commander Vexarak of the Zelthari Observation Corps, and I want to be very clear about one thing before I begin. I did not ask for this assignment. I have spent 42 years studying primitive civilizations. I have catalogued the mating rituals of the Borg, survived the singing competitions of the Lumari, and once spent 3 months pretending to be a decorative statue on a Velkan cargo ship just to collect behavioral data. I have never once filed a report that made the High Council nervous. Until now. It started on a Tuesday, which is apparently a day humans find deeply unpleasant. I arrived at what the official documentation called the Hartwell Military Academy at precisely 0600 hours, local planetary time. My cover identity was solid. I had the documentation of a visiting academic from a neutral observation world, a convincing set of credentials, and a translation device tucked behind my left ear that the humans would mistake for a hearing aid. I was not prepared for the noise. The moment I stepped through the front gate, the sound hit me like a wall. Not the sound of weapons or machinery, the sound of humans, hundreds of them, all moving at once, all talking, all doing something with their bodies that seemed completely unnecessary given the hour. Some were running, not because anything was chasing them, just running, in circles, on a track, voluntarily. I stood at the gate for 11 seconds, which, for a Zelthari observer, is a significant pause, and watched a group of young humans sprint past me, breathing hard, faces red, and somehow also laughing, while running. At 6 in the morning, I opened my field notebook and wrote my first observation. Subjects appear to experience physical suffering as a form of entertainment. Query: is this a ritual or a symptom? A young man nearly crashed into me. He was tall, dark-haired, breathing hard, wearing a gray uniform soaked through with sweat. He skidded to a stop about half a step away from my left arm, blinked, straightened up immediately, and said, "Sorry, sir, didn't see you there." Then he kept running. I stood very still for a moment. In Zelthari culture, if you nearly collide with a superior officer, there is a formal apology sequence that takes approximately 4 minutes and involves 3 different postures. This human had covered the entire thing in 4 words and was already 15 meters away. I wrote in my notebook, apology reflex, rapid, possibly submission-based, possibly just efficient. Investigate further. His name, I would later learn, was Cadet Owen Calloway. He would become what I can only describe as my primary source of confusion for the entire duration of this assignment. I made my way to the administration building, where I was met by the Academy's liaison officer, a woman named Colonel Grace Harmon. She was perhaps 50 years old by human reckoning, with gray streaks in her brown hair, and the kind of calm, flat expression that my species associates with experienced hunters. She shook my hand, a human greeting ritual that involves gripping each other's forelimbs, which I find extraordinary every time, and said, "Welcome to Hartwell, Doctor. We're glad to have an outside observer. Good for institutional transparency." I told her I was grateful for the access. She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "You'll want comfortable shoes," she said. "We walk a lot here." I looked down at her footwear, then at mine. Then I made a mental note to acquire what humans called trainers before the end of the day. She walked me through the main corridors of the academy, while giving me a brief orientation. I was mostly listening, but part of my attention was cataloging the environment. The walls were lined with photographs. Graduates, I assumed, given the formal uniforms. The floors were scuffed from heavy use. Every surface I could see was clean, but clearly not new. This was a place that had been used hard for a long time, and maintained with care rather than pride. I found that detail quietly interesting. Among the Zelthari, our military academies are ceremonial spaces, polished, impressive, designed to communicate power. This place communicated something else. It communicated work. "How many students do you currently have enrolled?" I asked. 812, Colonel Harmon said, "though we've had as many as 1,000 in previous years." "And the training duration?" 3 years for the standard officer track, 2 for the specialist programs. Some cadets stay for a 4th year on advanced tactical study. And in that time, what is the primary objective? I asked. To produce soldiers? She glanced at me sideways with an expression I had not yet learned to read. To produce people who can think when everything is going wrong, she said. The soldiering part, that comes with the thinking. I wrote that down. She left me with a junior aide named Cadet First Class Nina Doyle, who was assigned to escort me for the day. Nina was 19 years old, precise in her movements, and had the particular quality that I would come to associate with the best human students. She answered every question I asked without hesitation, and then immediately asked one back. "What exactly are you studying us for?" she asked, as she walked me toward the first training observation of the day. "Comparative institutional methodology," I said, which was the answer on my cover documentation. She nodded. "So you're looking at how we train people, compared to how other academies do it?" "In essence." "And what have you found so far?" "I have been here for approximately 37 minutes, I said. She smiled. "Fair enough." The first training session I observed was a physical fitness evaluation. I had reviewed the documentation beforehand. I understood, on an intellectual level, what was going to happen. But there is a significant difference between reading the words, "Cadets will complete a 2-mile run," followed by obstacle course navigation, and strength assessments, and actually watching it happen. I watched it happen. I watched young humans run 2 miles in the early morning, then immediately throw themselves at a series of walls, ropes, mud pits, and balance structures. I watched them fall, get up, keep going. I watched one young woman, a cadet named Petra Walsh according to my roster, slip off a rope climb, and land in the mud below, sit up, spit mud out of her mouth, look at the rope, and climb it again. I turned to Nina Doyle. "Is she injured?" Nina watched Petra for a moment. "Probably bruised. She'll be fine." "Should someone not assist her?" Nina looked at me with polite confusion, the way you look at someone who has asked why the sky is a particular color. "She didn't ask for assistance," she said simply. I looked back at Petra Walsh, who was now at the top of the rope, breathing hard, with mud on her face, and absolutely no visible intention of coming down until she was ready. I wrote in my notebook, "Human response to failure, immediate reattempt, no pause for emotional processing, no request for support unless voluntary. Note, this may not be stubbornness. This may be a trained response." Then I crossed out the word trained and replaced it with ingrained. Then I looked at the threat level I had pre-assigned to humanity, based on the initial intelligence files, and considered, for the first time, that perhaps I had been hasty. The number I had written was 0.3. I did not change it yet, but I put a small question mark next to it. By mid-morning, I had filled 6 pages of my field notebook, and I had a growing feeling that could only be described as the very early stages of professional concern. Not alarm, not yet, but the kind of quiet discomfort you feel when a calculation comes out to a number you were not expecting. I had come here expecting to observe a primitive species conducting primitive military exercises in a primitive facility. I had expected to be mildly bored. I had budgeted 12 days for this assignment, after which I intended to file a brief, comfortable report describing humanity as developing, non-threatening, and unlikely to achieve interstellar relevance within the next 4 centuries. Instead, I was standing on the edge of a training field, watching a cadet named Owen Calloway, the same one who had nearly run into me at the gate, solve a logistics problem that 3 of his team members had already failed to solve, using a method that was not in any training manual I had reviewed, and doing so while carrying full field equipment and operating on approximately 5 hours of sleep. He got it right. Then he explained it to the others. Then they all got it right. I stood very still for a moment and thought about the report I had been planning to write. Then Nina Doyle appeared at my elbow and said, "Lunch is in 20 minutes if you'd like to join the mess hall, Doctor." "Yes," I said. "I believe I would." I followed her across the training ground, and behind me I could hear Owen Calloway already asking his team what they could do differently next time. I had been on the planet for less than 6 hours. I did not sleep well that night. In my bunk at the off-campus accommodation the Academy had arranged for me, I reviewed my notes by the small light above my desk and found that I had written, at various points throughout the day, the following phrases: unexpected, note further, consult Galactic Physiology Index, why, how, and, once, simply the word no, underlined 3 times with no further context. I stared at that last one for a long time. I could not remember writing it, but I remembered the moment it referred to. It was during the afternoon session, when I had watched an instructor put a group of cadets through a timed navigation problem with incomplete information, and then, when none of them reached the correct answer, calmly explained that this was intentional, that the point was not to find the answer, but to observe how they behaved when an answer was not findable. "You'll face that more often than you expect," the instructor had said, and the cadets had written it down. No one argued. No one looked defeated. They wrote it down and moved on. I thought about that for a long time. Then I opened a new page in my notebook and wrote, at the top, in my own language, Preliminary Assessment, Day 1. Below that, I wrote, I may have miscalculated. I closed the notebook. I turned off the light. Outside the window, the academy grounds were quiet, but not entirely dark. In one of the training buildings across the field, a light was still on. Through the window, very faintly, I could see the outline of someone standing at a whiteboard. It was nearly midnight. I checked my records. The cadets had a 05:30 start the following morning. I watched the light in the window for a moment longer. Then I reopened my notebook and added one more line to my preliminary assessment. Threat level, under review. I went to sleep with the distinct feeling that this was going to be a much longer assignment than 12 days. I was right. Day 2 began with a sound I had not planned for. Not an alarm, not a siren, not the structured signal of an organized institution starting its day. What woke me at 05:15 was the sound of someone singing, badly, loudly, outside my window. I lay still for a moment, processing this. My translation device, still resting on the bedside table, caught enough of the words to confirm it was a song. Specifically, a song that appeared to be about a woman named Clementine and some kind of tragic mining accident, rendered with great enthusiasm and very little musical accuracy. I sat up, walked to the window, and looked out. 4 cadets were jogging past in the gray pre-dawn light, one of them singing, the other 3 apparently having chosen acceptance over resistance. None of them looked unhappy. 2 of them were smiling. One was shaking his head in a way that, I had already learned, meant affectionate frustration rather than actual distress. I watched them until they rounded the corner and the singing faded. Then I got dressed, picked up my notebook, and went to find out what today was going to teach me. What it taught me, before breakfast, was that I had fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of a military academy. I had assumed, based on the Zelthari model, based on every military institution I had previously studied, that the purpose was to produce obedience, to take individuals and shape them into components of a larger machine, to reduce variation, reduce unpredictability, and produce reliable, controllable units. By 0700, I had already seen enough to know that Hartwell Military Academy was doing almost the exact opposite. It began with a session I had been told was called a command decision exercise. A group of 12 cadets was given a scenario, a simulated crisis situation, and then split into 3 groups of 4, each group given different, incomplete information. They had 30 minutes to reach a collective decision. The scenario, as I understood it from the briefing sheet, involved a medical emergency in a hostile environment with limited resources and 2 competing priorities that could not both be fully satisfied. There was no clean solution. The point, as I would later confirm with the supervising instructor, was not to find the perfect answer. The point was to see how they argued. And they argued. Not angrily, not chaotically, but with a focused intensity that I found genuinely startling. They interrupted each other, and then apologized, and then built on what the other person had said. They changed their minds and said so out loud without apparent embarrassment. One cadet, I checked my roster and found his name was Declan Ford, proposed a solution, had it dismantled by a cadet named Lucy Marsh, and then said, "You're right, that doesn't work. What if we adjust the timeline?" and moved on without any visible wound to his pride. In Zelthari culture, Changing your stated position in a group setting is a significant social event. It requires a formal acknowledgement of the revision and carries certain status implications. It is not something done lightly or quickly. Declan Ford had done it in about 4 seconds and was already working on the next idea. I wrote very fast. By the time the 30 minutes were up, the 3 groups had not reached the same conclusion. They had reached 3 different conclusions, each of which addressed different aspects of the problem, and each of which the instructor found, apparently, equally valid. He did not tell them which was best. He told them all 3 would have real-world consequences, both positive and negative, and then he asked them to spend 10 minutes discussing what they would do differently with more information. They spent 12 minutes. No one noticed or cared about the extra 2. I had read, in my preliminary research, that human military culture valued something called initiative. I had understood it as a phrase. I was now watching it as a practice. And the difference between understanding a phrase and watching a practice is, I was finding, considerable. After the exercise, I approached the instructor. His name was Captain Elliot Graves. He was perhaps 45, lean, with the kind of eyes that were always doing a small calculation. He did not seem surprised that I wanted to talk to him. What exactly are you hoping they take away from an exercise where there is no correct answer? I asked. He thought about this for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer. I got the impression he was deciding how much of the answer to give me. Comfort, he said finally. Comfort with ambiguity? Comfort with being wrong, he said. If they're afraid of being wrong, they freeze. And in the field, freezing kills people. I need them to be so comfortable with getting things wrong that they can make a bad call, recognize it's bad, adjust, and keep moving without losing a second to embarrassment. He paused. The military doesn't need people who are always right. It needs people who can act when they don't know if they're right. I looked at him for a moment. That is a very unusual institutional philosophy, I said carefully. He shrugged. Maybe. But it works. I wrote 3 pages of notes during lunch. The afternoon brought something called an adversarial simulation, which I had been told was a form of structured war game. 2 teams, each with a different objective, a shared map with incomplete information on both sides, and a set of constraints designed to make both objectives impossible to achieve cleanly. I had been given a seat in the observation room above the simulation floor, next to a quiet, efficient woman named Lieutenant Cora Bentley, who ran the technical systems and was willing to answer my questions between tasks. Do they know they're being watched? I asked. Always, she said. But after the first 5 minutes, they forget. And what do you observe from up here that you cannot observe on the floor? She glanced at me. Patterns, she said. Down there, you see tactics. Up here, you see habits. I found that to be an extremely interesting distinction and wrote it down immediately. Below us, the simulation began. I will not attempt to describe every detail, because the tactical specifics were complex and would require a level of military context that would slow this report considerably. What I will say is this. Within 8 minutes, one team had done something that was not permitted by the rules of the simulation. Not illegal, not dishonest, not outside the boundaries that had been set, but something that was clearly not intended by the people who designed the exercise, something that found a gap between the rules and the intent of the rules, and walked through it. I leaned forward. Is that allowed? Lieutenant Bentley had the look of someone who had seen this before. The rules don't say it isn't, she said. Will they be penalized? No. Will it be addressed? In the debrief, yes. The team that lost will probably spend some time upset about it. She glanced at me. But tomorrow, both teams will know how to do it. That's the point. I sat back. Below us, the team that had found the gap was pushing their advantage, efficiently, without celebration, adjusting their approach as the other team responded. The other team, to their credit, was not giving up. They were changing tactics in real time, trying 3 different approaches in the space of 4 minutes, looking for a counter. They didn't find one in time, but they found 2 of the 3 possibilities. They almost had it, I said. They'll have it next time, Lieutenant Bentley said. This, I was beginning to understand, was the fundamental grammar of Hartwell Military Academy. Not "you failed." Not "you succeeded." Always, always. Next time. Over dinner that evening, a meal I took alone in my room, because I needed to think without being interrupted by humans who, I had discovered, will talk to any available person at any available moment. I reviewed what I had observed across 2 days and asked myself a question that I had not expected to be asking. The question was not, "Are humans dangerous?" I had already begun to suspect the answer to that. The question was, what kind of dangerous? There is a category of threat that the Zelthari threat assessment system calls kinetic, strong, fast, physically capable, dangerous in the way that a large rock falling from a height is dangerous, predictable in its mechanism, if not always in its timing. There is another category called structural. Societies with superior technology, or superior resources, or superior numbers. Dangerous in the way that a deep ocean is dangerous, overwhelming rather than sharp. And there is a third category, one that appears rarely in the formal literature, one that most threat assessors treat as theoretical. It is called adaptive. A threat that is dangerous not because of what it can do right now, but because of what it will be able to do next time, because it learns, because it fails and then gets better, and then fails again, and gets better again, indefinitely, without limit, without ceiling. I sat in my room and looked at my notebook. I had been recording 2 days of data. Everything I had seen fell into the third category. I put my fork down. The food went cold. I opened a new page and wrote, at the top, the words, "Revised Preliminary Assessment." Below that, I wrote a number. Not 0.3. Not yet a final number, but not 0.3. I wrote 3.1, with the note, "Accelerating. Reassess weekly." Then I sat back and thought about how I was going to explain to the High Council that I needed more than 12 days. I decided to simply not mention the 12 days and file weekly reports instead. Some administrative decisions are best made unilaterally. I closed my notebook and looked out the window. Across the grounds, the light in the training building was on again. Same window as last night. Same outline at the whiteboard. I checked the time. It was 22:40. Reveille was at 05:30. I watched the light for a long moment. Then I wrote one more line in my notebook, below the revised threat assessment. Query: when do they sleep? As of the writing of this line, I do not have a satisfactory answer. I have been at Hartwell Military Academy for 11 days, and I have begun to suspect that my presence here is no longer as covert as I intended. Not because anyone has identified me as non-human. My cover remains intact, my documentation has not been questioned. My translation device has functioned without error, and I have successfully navigated every social interaction without triggering suspicion. The problem is not that they suspect what I am. The problem is that they suspect what I am doing. It began with Colonel Harmon. On day 7, she invited me to her office for what she called a check-in, which is apparently a human practice of confirming that a visitor has everything they need. She offered me tea, which I accepted. She asked how the observation was going, and I gave her a measured, academically appropriate answer about finding the methodology richly informative. She nodded, sipped her tea, then said, "You take a lot of notes." "I do," I agreed. "It is standard practice in comparative research." "I've had outside observers before," she said. "Academic types, policy people, journalists once. Nobody has ever filled 11 notebooks in 7 days." I looked at her. "I write small," I said. She looked back at me with the same expression she had worn on day 1, the flat, calm, hunter's expression. "Of course," she said, and changed the subject. But after I left her office, I had the distinct feeling of being watched by someone better at watching than I was, which was a feeling I was not accustomed to. The instructors were another matter entirely. By day 8, I had attended enough sessions to form a clear picture of the teaching staff at Hartwell, and I want to record here, for the benefit of the High Council, that this picture is one of the most concerning things I have observed on this planet. The instructors are not young. The most junior member of the permanent teaching staff appears to be in his mid-30s by human reckoning, and several of the senior instructors are well past 50. In Zelthari military culture, senior instructors are ceremonial roles. Respected, certainly, but the active teaching, the day-to-day transmission of skill, is handled by those at peak physical condition. At Hartwell, the senior instructors are the ones running the hardest sessions. Captain Elliot Graves, whom I have already mentioned, routinely completes the same physical courses he assigns to the cadets, not as a demonstration but simply as part of his morning. He does this before the formal day begins. He is 46 years old, and there are 3 cadets in the current cohort who cannot match his pace. Major Helen Ashby, who runs the Command Strategy Program, spent 28 years in active operational service before taking this post. I reviewed her public service record. It is 14 pages long. I will not reproduce it here, but I will note that it contains entries which, if they described a Zelthari officer, would result in that officer being assigned to lead an entire sector fleet. She teaches here instead, by choice. When I asked her why, carefully, academically, within the frame of my cover identity, she looked at me with the patience of someone who has been asked a question that seems complicated, but is actually simple. Because this is where the work gets done, she said. Anyone can win a battle. It takes something rarer to teach someone else how to think through one. I wrote that down and then sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the implications of a society that considers teaching its highest-ranked people's best use of time. In the Zelthari system, our most experienced officers are administrators. They set policy. They attend ceremonies. They review reports filed by people like me. Helen Ashby was currently redesigning the second-year curriculum because she had identified a gap in how cadets were being taught to evaluate incomplete intelligence. The gap she identified was the same gap I had noticed, independently, in my Day 3 observations. I found that both impressive and slightly alarming. The third instructor who concerns me most is a man named Warrant Officer Patrick Dow. He is 61 years old. He teaches survival skills, close quarters decision-making, and something the cadets call the hard class, though its formal name is psychological resilience under operational stress. I attended one session. I will summarize it briefly, because a full account would exceed my available space. Warrant Officer Dow put 12 cadets in a room, told them they were going to be given an impossible task, and then gave them an impossible task. The task involved making a logistical decision with insufficient resources, under time pressure, with 2 members of the group designated as compromised and unable to speak. A simulation of working alongside injured personnel. The task was genuinely impossible. I confirmed this afterward by working through the mathematics myself. There was no configuration of the available resources that satisfied all the constraints. Every team failed. Warrant Officer Dow then spent 40 minutes debriefing each failure in precise, specific detail. Not unkindly, not harshly, but with the kind of exactness that left no room for vagueness or self-deception. He named every decision point. He named every moment where a different choice was possible. He asked each cadet to articulate, in their own words, what they would do differently, and he waited until the answer was specific before accepting it. One cadet, a young man named Raymond Cole, gave a vague answer about communicating better. Warrant Officer Dow waited. Raymond Cole tried again, more specifically. Warrant Officer Dow waited. Raymond Cole, on his third attempt, described the exact moment he had failed to relay a piece of information, the exact reason he hadn't relayed it, and the exact adjustment he would make next time. Warrant Officer Dow nodded. "Good," he said. "That's what I needed to hear." The whole exchange took 4 minutes. Raymond Cole looked tired and thoughtful, but not defeated. By the time the session ended, he was already talking to the cadet next to him about what she had identified in her own debrief. I sat in the back of that room and thought about a word that humans use: accountability. Not as punishment, not as blame, as a tool for improvement. I had read the word. I had seen it used in many documents, but watching it practiced, watching a 61-year-old warrant officer sit with a 19-year-old cadet and refuse to accept a vague answer, not out of cruelty, but out of genuine investment in that cadet's development. I understood, for the first time, that humans have built a culture around the idea that being wrong is only a problem if you don't examine it. I revised my threat assessment to 5.8 that evening. I also sent a message to the High Council, informing them that my assignment would require an extended timeline. I did not specify how extended. I said I would know more in several weeks. The High Council replied asking if I was well. I replied that I was fine, and that humanity was very interesting. They replied that I should not eat anything from street vendors. I considered explaining that this was not the nature of my concern, decided against it, and went back to my notebook. On day 10, something happened that I had not planned for, which is itself notable because I planned for most things. I was observing a small group tactics session in the Eastern Training Ground when Cadet Owen Calloway, who appeared, somehow, to be in approximately 60% of the sessions I attended, despite being a single person in a cohort of over 800, stopped next to me during a break and said, without preamble, "You're not a researcher, are you?" It was not a question. I kept my expression neutral. "I beg your pardon?" He looked at me with the kind of direct attention that young humans are usually too distracted to sustain. "I mean, you might be a researcher, but that's not the main thing. You're assessing something." He paused. "The way you watch the drills, you're not watching what we're doing. You're watching how we respond when something goes wrong." I looked at him for a moment. "You have a very observant nature," I said. He shrugged. "We're trained to notice things." He glanced out at the training ground, where the session was about to resume. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just think you should know that a few of us have noticed." He paused. "We think whatever you're assessing us for, we'd rather know." "That is understandable," I said carefully. "But I am afraid I cannot discuss the specific parameters of my research." He nodded, as if this was the answer he expected. Then he said, "Fair enough," and walked back to his group without another word. I wrote down, Cadet Calloway. Note for follow-up. High threat of institutional intuition in general population. Then I looked at him across the training ground, already back in the drill, already focused, and thought about the fact that a 19-year-old cadet in a military academy had noticed what trained Zelthari intelligence analysts had not detected in my file for 11 years. I revised my threat assessment to 6.4. I also noted, in the margin, the young ones are watching. As indeed they were. Something changed on day 14. I know the exact moment it happened. It was 0840, on a Thursday, in a second-year tactics classroom, with wooden desks and a whiteboard that had been used so many times. Its surface was permanently gray. Major Helen Ashby was teaching a session on what humans call operational failure analysis, which is the formal study of things that went wrong, and why. This is, I should note, an entire subject, a structured academic discipline. There are textbooks, which I had obtained copies of from the Academy Library. There are case studies. There are standard frameworks for conducting the analysis and presenting the findings. It is treated with the same seriousness as any other area of knowledge, with the same expectation of rigor and the same standards of evidence. In Zelthari culture, we do not have a discipline called failure analysis. We have after-action reviews, which are administrative procedures. We have disciplinary processes, which handle accountability for specific errors. But the systematic, structured, ongoing study of what went wrong and how to extract value from it, as a field, as a body of knowledge, as something you can spend years developing expertise in, that does not exist. I sat in the back of Helen Ashby's classroom and understood, with a clarity I had not expected, that this was not a gap in Zelthari culture. It was a philosophical position. We had decided, somewhere in our long history, that failure was something to process and move past. Humans had decided that failure was something to mine. The session that morning was focused on 3 historical military operations, all of which had resulted in significant losses for the human forces involved. Major Ashby walked through each one in precise, unsparing detail. She did not soften the outcomes. She did not perform regret or reassurance. She simply described what happened, when, why, and what could have been done differently, with the same matter-of-fact tone she would have used to describe a successful operation. A cadet named Becca Thornton asked why the 3rd operation had failed despite adequate planning. Major Ashby said, "Because the planners planned for the enemy they expected, not the enemy that showed up." The room went quiet for a moment. "How do you plan for something you don't expect?" Becca asked. Major Ashby put her marker down. "You can't plan for every specific thing, but you can plan for the fact that something unexpected will happen. You build flexibility into your structure. You train your people to make decisions without waiting for permission. You create a culture where the person closest to the problem has the authority to respond to it." She paused. "You don't prevent surprise. You prepare your people to function inside it." I wrote that down. Then I underlined it. Then I put the notebook down, which I almost never do, and I just sat with the idea for a moment. In Zelthari military doctrine, surprise is something to be avoided. We spend enormous resources on intelligence, on prediction, on reducing the probability of encountering the unexpected. Our systems are designed to route decisions upward. When something unexpected happens, it is reported to a superior, who reports to their superior, who convenes a review. Helen Ashby was teaching her students to assume the unexpected would arrive, and to be ready to make decisions the moment it did, without waiting for anyone above them to process it first. I thought about what that meant in practice. I thought about 800 cadets, all being trained to this standard, all developing the capacity to adapt in real time, all building the habit of responding to surprise with action, rather than with upward escalation. Then I thought about how many of those 800 cadets would become officers. Then I thought about how many officers like that it would take to make a military that could respond to anything it encountered, at any level of the chain of command, without hesitation. I picked my notebook back up. I wrote, 7.1. After the classroom session, I stayed behind while the cadets filed out. Major Ashby was erasing the whiteboard. I waited until the room was empty. "Major Ashby," I said. She turned. "I have a question that is somewhat outside the scope of my stated research," I said, "and I would understand if you preferred not to answer it." She waited. She was good at waiting. "How long does it take?" I asked. "To build what you build here, to take a person and produce what these cadets become?" She thought for a moment. 3 years, she said. "The formal program." "No," I said. "I mean, in truth, not the formal program. How long does it actually take to produce the kind of thinking I have observed in this institution? The adaptability, the comfort with failure, the capacity to act under uncertainty." She looked at me for a long time. "It starts before we get them," she said at last. "We don't build it from nothing. We shape what's already there. What we build here is the structure, the discipline, the vocabulary for things they already, most of them, know how to feel." She paused. "You're asking how long it takes to make a person like that, but the honest answer is that we don't make them. We find them, and then we show them how much they can do with what they already are." I stood in that empty classroom for a long time after she left. Outside, a group of cadets was crossing the ground toward the afternoon session. I could hear them talking, low voices, some laughter, the specific sound of people who are tired but still engaged, still working, still thinking. I revised my threat assessment one more time. 7.9. Then I did something I had not done since my first week in the field, 22 years ago. I wrote, in the margin of my notebook, in my own language, 3 words that translated roughly as, "I was wrong." Not about the mission, not about the data, about the assumption I had brought with me when I arrived. The assumption that a species still using physical training grounds and wooden desks and whiteboards and paper certificates was a species I understood. I did not understand them. I was not sure I would, entirely, before this assignment was done. But I was beginning to, and the picture that was forming was not what I had expected. It was something larger, something worth considerably more attention than 12 days. I put the notebook in my bag and walked out into the afternoon light. Across the grounds, Owen Calloway was running sprints. Still, again. He'd been doing them since before the classroom session, as far as I could tell. His face was red, his uniform was dark with sweat, and he was absolutely not done. I watched him for a moment. He did not stop. He did not look up. I walked back to my room to write a very different kind of report than the one I had originally planned. I have been at Hartwell Military Academy for 26 days, and I have attended the event that humans call Graduation Week, and I want to be very clear in this section of my report. I was not prepared for it. I thought I was. I had reviewed the schedule. I had read the program. I understood the format, the sequence, the ceremonial elements. I had even done background research on human graduation rituals in general, so I arrived with what I believed was an appropriate frame of reference. The frame did not fit. Graduation week at Hartwell was not a ceremony. It was a test. A final, sustained, multi-day test that began before the cadets were told it had begun, and did not end until after they thought it was over. It was, as far as I could determine from observation, and from my conversations with junior staff, the single most sophisticated assessment process I had ever witnessed, applied to individuals who were not yet professionals in their field. It started on Monday morning with what appeared, on the schedule, to be a routine session. Standard morning exercise, standard breakfast, a session listed as administrative review. I attended the administrative review. 20 minutes in, a scenario was introduced, quietly, without announcement. The scenario was not labeled as a scenario. It was presented as a real administrative problem requiring immediate input from cadet leadership. The first cadet to be asked for input was Lucy Marsh, who I had been watching since day 3. She had just come from the morning run. She was drinking water from a bottle. She was told, without preamble, that a supply convoy had encountered an unexpected route closure, and that the logistics for the week needed to be redesigned, now, with the information available, which was incomplete. Lucy Marsh put her water bottle down. She looked at the information she had been given. She asked 2 questions, both of which I noted as precisely targeted, not asking for more information broadly, but asking for the 2 specific pieces of missing information that would have the most impact on the decision. She was given partial answers. She worked with the partial answers. 7 minutes later, she had a revised plan. It was not perfect. She knew it was not perfect. She said so, out loud, while presenting it. And then she said exactly which parts of it she would revise as more information became available, and in what order. The officer evaluating her made a note. Lucy Marsh picked up her water bottle and went to her next session. I had been at Hartwell for 26 days at that point. I had seen this pattern hundreds of times. But watching it in this context, in what I now understood was the final evaluation of whether these people were ready to hold the responsibilities they were about to be given, I found it newly affecting. She was ready. She had been ready before she walked into that room. The room was just the formal confirmation. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern, though each day brought different pressures. Physical assessments that were harder than anything in the standard curriculum. Group exercises designed specifically to produce conflict among the team, so the evaluators could observe how it was resolved. Individual sessions where each cadet sat with a panel and was asked to walk through their biggest mistake of the past year and what they had learned from it. That last one, I attended as an observer in the back of the room, with the permission of Colonel Harmon, who by this point had stopped asking me what I was writing and had simply begun ensuring I had good sight lines. The session was extraordinary. Cadet after cadet sat in front of the panel and talked, with remarkable clarity, about failure. Not their successes, not their achievements, their failures. Their specific failures, with specific details, and specific analysis, and specific articulations of how those failures had changed them. One cadet, a young woman named Iris Holt, talked for 7 minutes about a group exercise from her first year, in which she had made a command decision, without consulting her team, had been correct, and had therefore not understood until much later why it had been wrong. She described the gap between being correct and being right. She described what she had done since to ensure she understood the difference. The panel asked her 3 follow-up questions, each of which she answered without hesitation. They made notes. She left the room. I sat in my chair in the back of the room and thought about Iris Holt, who was 22 years old and could articulate the difference between being correct and being right. And I thought about the Zelthari generals I had met in my career. Decorated, senior, experienced. And I tried to remember if I had ever heard one of them describe a decision they had made, in retrospect, as not right even when it was correct. I could not remember a single instance. I revised my threat assessment to 8.6. I also, on that same day, sent a message to the High Council, informing them that my report would be significantly longer than standard parameters, and that I was requesting an extension to complete it properly. The High Council replied, asking if I had encountered a problem. I replied that I had encountered a civilization. They did not respond to this. The final day of the evaluation was followed by a day of rest, and then by the graduation ceremony itself. I will describe the ceremony in sufficient detail for the record. It was held outdoors, on the main parade ground of the academy, on a morning that began gray and turned bright by the time the event began. There were seats for guests, families of the graduating cadets, who had traveled from various parts of the planet to be there. There was a band, which played with precision. There were flags, which I had learned carried significant symbolic weight for humans, in a way that I find difficult to fully translate, but that I understand functionally. The graduating class of the year, 314 people, the largest class Hartwell had produced in recent history, marched in. They were in their formal uniforms, which I had not seen them in before. I had only seen them in training gear, in classroom clothes, in sweat-soaked exercise uniforms. Seeing them now, in formal dress, in straight ranks, in complete silence, was a different experience. They looked different. Not physically, not in age or feature, but in the way they held themselves. The way 314 people can move together, in step, in silence, and create something that is more than the sum of the people doing it. It was the first time in 26 days that I had watched these cadets do something that looked like what I had originally expected military training to produce. And somehow, having watched everything that preceded it, it meant more. Colonel Harmon spoke first. She was brief. She did not congratulate them. She thanked them. For choosing this, she said. For committing to something difficult in a world that offers many easier paths. For being willing, 3 years ago, to walk through a gate and say, "Make me useful." Then General William Vance spoke. General Vance was the senior officer of the academy, and, I had gathered from context and from careful reading of the institutional records, something very close to what humans mean when they say, legend. He had served for 37 years. He had been involved in events I will not enumerate here because they are recorded in the Galactic Threat Registry, and I do not want to cross-reference this report with that database prematurely. He was 70 years old and walked with a slight unevenness from an old injury, and when he stood at the podium, the entire parade ground went completely silent. He looked at the graduating class for a long moment before he spoke. "You are not ready," he said. The silence held. "You think you might be. Some days you even feel ready. But you are not ready, and the work you are about to begin will show you, quickly, how much more there is." He paused. "This is not a problem. This is the design. You were not trained to be ready. You were trained to be capable. Capability is not a destination, it is a practice." Another pause. "The day you feel ready is the day you should worry. The day you feel like there is nothing more to learn is the day you should step back and let someone younger take your place. Stay unready. Stay hungry. Stay in the question." He said more. I transcribed the entirety of his remarks. They run to 6 pages in my notebook, and I have attached the full text to this report as Appendix C, because I believe it warrants separate review by the High Council. But those first words stayed with me through the rest of the ceremony. Through the calling of each name, 314 names, each one met with applause from the gathered families, each new officer stepping forward to receive their commission. Through the final music, through the crowd that broke into motion at the end, families moving toward graduates, the whole ground filling with the noise and warmth of people who had survived something together. I stood at the edge of the parade ground and watched. Lieutenant Owen Calloway, because he was lieutenant now, he had been commissioned that morning, found me, as I had somehow expected he would, about 40 minutes into the post-ceremony gathering. He was with a small group, and they parted slightly as he broke off and walked over. He shook my hand. "Did you get what you came for?" he asked. I considered several possible answers. "Not entirely," I said. "I find I have more questions than when I arrived." He seemed to find this satisfying. "Good questions or bad ones?" "Large ones," I said. He nodded, the way young people nod, when they have decided they understand something they probably don't fully understand yet. But there was something genuine in it. "We'll be around," he said. if you have more to observe. He rejoined his group. I watched them for a while, this group of new officers, laughing and talking, and already, several of them, in quiet conversation that had the focus and energy of people who were thinking about work even on the day of their graduation. I stood there until the crowd began to thin. Then I walked back to my room, sat at my desk, opened a new page in my notebook, and began to write the section of my report I had been building toward for 26 days. At the top of the page I wrote, Final Threat Assessment. Below that, I wrote a number, which I will present in the closing section of this report. Below that number I wrote 2 words, Immediate Action. And I began to explain. This is the final section of my report to the Zelthari High Council, and I want to begin it with a direct statement of the kind that I have, in 22 years of intelligence work, very rarely had occasion to write. I was wrong. I was wrong about humanity when I filed my preliminary assessment 3 years ago. I was wrong when I categorized them as a developing civilization unlikely to achieve significant interstellar relevance within 4 centuries. I was wrong when I assigned them a threat level of 0.3 and scheduled a 12-day observation assignment that I expected to complete in 10. I am not wrong about the things I observed. My data is sound. My methodology was rigorous. My notes, which you will find attached to this report in 17 volumes, are accurate and detailed. What I was wrong about was the framework I used to interpret what I observed before I observed it. I will now present my final conclusions. I ask the Council to read them carefully, and without the instinct to dismiss, because I understand that some of what follows will be surprising, and perhaps uncomfortable, and perhaps genuinely alarming. It should be. First, humans are not a kinetic threat in the conventional sense. They are not, individually, the strongest or fastest species in the documented galaxy. Their technology is not, currently, the most advanced. Their fleet capacity, their weapon systems, their immediate military reach, all of these remain within parameters that the Zelthari expansion program has previously determined to be manageable. This assessment is accurate, and also, in my considered opinion, nearly useless. Here is what the conventional assessment misses. Humans have constructed, at every level of their society, a system for converting failure into capability. They do not simply learn from their mistakes. They have built formal institutions, professional disciplines, cultural practices, and intergenerational traditions specifically designed to extract maximum value from every failure at every scale, from the individual to the civilizational. They have been doing this, I believe, for most of their recorded history. The results compound. When the Zelthari expansion program calculated human threat at the current level, it was comparing them to what they are now. The relevant question is not what they are now. The relevant question is what their trajectory produces. Second, human military culture does not produce soldiers. It produces thinkers. The distinction matters enormously. Soldiers are dangerous in proportion to their equipment and numbers. Thinkers are dangerous in proportion to their problems. The more difficult the problem, the more adaptive the response. The more constrained the resources, the more creative the solution. I watched 314 young people spend 3 years being trained to function at their best when everything around them is worst. I watched this for 26 days, and I am here to tell you, they function at their best when everything around them is worst. Third, the human quality that our initial assessments most consistently underweighted is the one they call morale. We have treated this as a psychological variable, a measure of how willing a population is to continue fighting. I now believe this is a fundamental misclassification. Human morale is not a measure of willingness. It is a force multiplier. It is the mechanism by which a group of humans converts shared difficulty into shared capability. I watched this happen daily for nearly 4 weeks. I watched tired, physically stressed, psychologically pressured young people become more capable in direct proportion to the difficulty they were experiencing, because they had been trained to draw strength from each other in exactly those conditions. We have no analog for this in Zelthari culture. I want to be precise about this. It is not that we have a weaker version of this quality. It is that we do not have it. Our military structures are designed to reduce interpersonal variables, not to weaponize them. This is a structural disadvantage that I had not previously considered. Fourth, and finally, I spent 26 days watching humanity being trained, and on the last of those days I watched a 70-year-old general stand in front of 314 newly commissioned officers and tell them the most important thing they could do was stay unready. Stay hungry. Stay in the question. And they listened, and they believed it. And they will carry it with them into every position they hold, and every decision they make, and every younger person they eventually train. This is not a civilization approaching its ceiling. This is a civilization that has built itself to not have one. My final threat assessment is 9.6 out of 10. The remaining 0.4 I am reserving for the possibility that I have still underestimated them, which the data suggests is more likely than not. My recommendation to the Zelthari High Council is as follows, in order of priority. 1. Sector 7 Gamma is to be immediately and permanently excluded from all expansion planning. This recommendation is to be classified at the highest available level. No expansion-oriented communication regarding that sector is to occur via any channel that humans could theoretically intercept. And given what I have observed of their signals intelligence curriculum, I am extending theoretically to cover a wider range than our standard security protocols currently assume. 2. All existing threat assessments of human civilization are to be reviewed, revised, and placed on an accelerated update cycle. The standard 4-year review period is not appropriate for a civilization developing at this rate. 3. I am recommending, in the strongest possible terms, that the Zelthari Diplomatic Affairs Office initiate formal, peaceful, mutually respectful contact with human civilization within the next decade, before we are in a position where they initiate contact with us. I want to be understood on this point. I am not suggesting that humans are preparing to attack us. I have seen no evidence of aggressive intent toward Zelthari interests. I am suggesting that humans are developing, consistently and deliberately, in a direction that will make them impossible to manage by any means other than genuine partnership, and that we will be better served by establishing that partnership now, from a position of relative parity, than later, from a position of relative disadvantage. I have been doing this job for 22 years. I have filed 143 reports. This is the first time I have ever included the word partnership in a threat assessment. I mean it. I have 3 additional notes that I am including for the sake of completeness. First, Cadet Lieutenant Owen Calloway, who I have referenced throughout this report, has accepted a posting to the 4th Rapid Response Division, which is one of the human military's most operationally active units. I expect him to be remarkable. I have noted his name for long-term monitoring, though I want to be clear in the record that this is professional interest, not personal investment. Second, I have accepted Lieutenant Calloway's invitation to return next year and observe the incoming class. This is purely for ongoing intelligence purposes, and has nothing to do with the fact that I have, somehow, over the course of 26 days, become genuinely interested in what these people do next. Third, I have also enrolled in something called a 5K run, which Cadet First Class Nina Doyle mentioned in passing on my last day, and which I accepted without fully thinking it through. I am currently unclear on whether I can complete it. This concern is occupying more of my mental space than I would like to admit. I am not including this third item in the main body of the report. I am including it in this footnote, which I ask the High Council to treat with discretion. The point is this. 26 days ago, I arrived at a human military academy with a pre-assigned threat level of 0.3 and the confident expectation that I would be filing a brief, unremarkable report and moving on to my next assignment. Instead, I am filing this. I am not entirely sure what happened. Actually, I know exactly what happened. I watched humanity, and humanity, as I should have expected but did not, turned out to be the most interesting and most formidable thing I have encountered in 22 years of intelligence work. Not because of their weapons, not because of their technology, not because of their numbers, but because of the astonishing, relentless, boundless way they refuse to stop getting better. They will be a force in this galaxy. The only question is whether they will be a force alongside us, or in spite of us. I know which I would recommend. End of report. Filed by Commander Vexarak, Zelthari Observation Corps, Field Station 7. Addendum. Do not, under any circumstances, challenge them to anything.